This is another episode of the WREAK Havoc podcast, and today we have a very special guest, Michael Wallach. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to talk to you guys. I usually do like alternative health podcasts and that kind of thing, and you guys are coming from another perspective, so that's kind of fun and interesting for me. So it's great.
Definitely, yeah. And within the podcast we have here, it really doesn't matter. We really don't go too niche either direction. You know, the audience is young people, impressionable people, and people of the digital age. So it really comes down to being able to be aware of everything that's going on in life, not just, one side or the other, or niche or the other. And that's what this podcast is about. So tell me a little bit and tell the audience about who you are, maybe your story and what got you to this point.
Well, my story's a long one. I'm not really sure where to start, but the most recent thing, we could talk about how on earth I ended up doing this, but I just I just came out with a documentary series called The Viral Delusion, which is about, in a lot of ways, about the history of medicine and the history of disease. And of course about COVID and what's been going on the last couple of years. It's a really different take than what you'll hear in the mainstream news. It's a really different take than what you'll hear from most doctors. I think in a lot of ways that's what makes it really interesting. But it's also really meaningful to me. The journey of making this movie probably goes back at least 10 years for me. I would say really about 15 years to when my wife got sick about 15 years ago. And we had to really go beyond what the normal, standard of care was offering in order to figure out what was going on. And when we did, we figured it out right away, and it wasn't a problem after that. So that was sort of what opened my eyes to realizing that the mainstream medical complex is not what is advertised to be. And once you open that door, man, that is just a massive, massive industry. It is a massive set of intellectual paradigms that history has thrown our way, that are broken, that are not doing service to people. And most people, certainly me, like when I was in my 20s and younger, I didn't realize that. I thought, you go to the doctor and the doctor tries to make you better, and that's kind of the end of the story. And the doctor's this really well-educated person, and that's they sort of have a monopoly on how to think about health, and that's just not the case. It's absolutely not the case. So as I said, it was a long journey to get to the point where I made this documentary series, but it's such an incredible story. I felt like the more I learned, the more I wanted to get it out there.
Definitely, and I was watching the trailer just today for on your website, and it was very interesting, intriguing actually. With all these doctors and journalists having their takes, and especially of course it goes against the grain of what is the status quo of today. Now, tell us a little bit about when do you think this started? Because I was just digging around some statistics today, and you were talking about mainstream media. I think we were looking at 11% is the confidence rating for television media, and around 16% for newspaper. Where did this start? What do you think? Let's not just go down the rabbit hole of what mainstream media is and all that, but what about confidence in the whole industrial complex of what is medicine? When did this kind of start where there may not be everything may not be what it seems? Where do you think that started?
Oh man, it's funny because some, there's people who look at different aspects of this, and one of the scientists that that I interviewed and spoke with at great length, who's really been a foundational, fundamental force in exposing a lot of the fraud. I mean, he traces it back thousands of years to a sort of sense of materialism. But I would say, in a big way, it started with Pasteur in the mid 1800s. Everybody knows about Louis Pasteur. He's kind of considered the grandfather of modern medicine. Your pasteurized milk, and there's all sorts of, basically the foundations of germ theory go back to Pasteur. But what people don't realize is that he was an out-and-out fraud. And we know this because he kept two sets of notebooks. And one was the set of notebooks that he was outwardly showing to the public, and the other were his private notebooks that he kept for himself. And when he died, he left those notebooks in his will to his family under the instructions that they never be shown outside the family. But one of his descendants, not too long ago, felt that they were sitting on really valuable knowledge, and gave access to those notebooks to a professor at Princeton to go back and look through them to get at a deeper understanding of who this man was. And what the professor at Princeton discovered was that he was a fraud, and he was even writing it to himself. Don't let this get out there. This is what I've really done. This is what I'm saying. And again, this really is the grandfather of modern medicine. So, I think a lot of it goes back to Pasteur, and the idea that medicine could be weaponized and industrialized. So back, in France, in the mid 1800s, you see the growth of the beginnings of the pharmaceutical industry. And the idea that if they can label a germ or some particle as the cause of disease, then they can manufacture a poison that will kill that germ, and then they could sell that. And the French nobility was highly invested in basically in the beginnings here of the pharmaceutical industry, and so you had the beginnings of the same, what I would call, say, fascism that we have today, which is the growth of the three components. One is the industrial component. The second is the political component. And then the third is the scientific or pseudoscientific justification. So the scientific institutional role there. And so long as these three institutions were all making money and were all pushing each other, there was really nothing that could stop them. So there were scientists, during Pasteur's day who would speak out. There's a very famous scientist named Beauchamp who tried to expose Pasteur. There were numerous countries where Pasteur wanted to come and quote unquote vaccinate their sheep or their animals, and the countries began to grow suspicious of this man. And you can read the letters back and forth between farmers and Pasteur. Basically, the farmers saying, if you want to come and inject all our sheep, we've heard that the last sheep you injected all died. So you better present us with some evidence that you're not going to kill our sheep. And once he's presented with this happened in Italy, it happened in Russia. The Pasteur would back down, and he would just kind of move on and try to, bring the circus somewhere else. So I think, he was really a monumental figure in how this whole way of thinking has been built on a house of cards from day one. And then you see the same thing with the rise of the German pharmaceutical companies a little bit after that. And then you also see with the rise of Edward Jenner in England and his attempt to convince everybody that smallpox was due to a virus that he could, quote unquote, immunize people from. And again, you saw many many doctors at the time speaking out, saying this is absurd, it's not working. He would essentially experiment on orphans and kill numerous orphans. His own son died at a very young age. But he played a really big role in the growth of the idea that that doctors could make money not just from sick people, that they could actually go around and they could sell this idea that they could see as customers the entire population. So it became a very popular idea. Going way back, and then it was used early on for political purposes as well. Like you had, French government officials saying that German boats can't use French docks because German boats have bacteria on them that French boats don't have. And then the Germans came back and they said the same thing about French boats. So I would say in our modern times, that's the first, Pasteur and Edward Jenner and Robert Koch in Germany. Those are the three sort of key figures. Every one of them has been exposed as practicing pseudoscience. We now know, but they're the three pillars of modern medicine. When it comes to chronic disease, when it comes to epidemiology, but that's still what most doctors learn in medical school. They're not exposed to any of the critical literature, any of the critical history, and anybody who's read history knows that you have to read the critical literature in history if you're going to understand what happened, because the victors write the story, and if you don't read the critical literature, you just don't even know what the story was. So anyway, that's a bit of a long answer, but
it's good. It's good. Yeah. So pretty much stems back to fame / greed / propaganda as like a three-legged stool of just pseudoscience.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think that's true, and I don't think that. I think that it's very easy to convince yourself that you have discovered something really exciting on behalf of humanity if you start to see a little bit of evidence pointing in your direction, and then you run with it, and then other people run with it, and before you know it, it's become a whole. It's just entered into the mainstream ideology, and you're being foisted on people's shoulders, and it's very hard at that point to say maybe I was wrong. But I don't think. I think Pasteur is just clearly a fraud. Maybe he held out the hope that he was right, but that his experiments just weren't proving what he quote unquote knew to be the case. A long time ago, I used to work for the State Department, and I was a pollster. I would do surveys of people around the world to get a sense of like what they think about various issues. And if your polls came back differently than what you quote unquote knew to be the case, it was very hard to accept those results. You didn't want necessarily to go out and say, oh, actually, it's different than what I thought. You want to just kind of keep going back and well, let me test it again because I'm pretty sure this other thing that I thought is true. And so sometimes reality can, smack you in the face. And if in Pasteur's case, I think what he was doing is he was just saying, well, let's just sweep it under the rug because it must not be true. What I thought, what my superstitions are, that's got to be the case. And I think, like, to a huge degree, that's what we're seeing now.
So basically, a lot of people of science not even following the scientific method themselves, or not practicing what they preach. Very interesting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the scientific method is like it's very hard to find in science now. Very hard to find.
Which is absurd, right?
It's totally absurd. It's totally absurd. I mean, I spoke to like David Rasnick. He was a 40-year biochemist, PhD, ran a big, lab for one of the biggest biological testing companies in the world. And he was, his words, science is dead. Science is dead. I said, well, who's doing good science now? He said, nobody's doing good science. It doesn't exist. It literally doesn't exist. Nobody asks questions. Nobody follows the scientific method. What you get is a bunch of boys with toys. You have a lot of big, fancy computerized equipment where people run computer models of all sorts of hypothetical simulations, and then they call that science. But it's not. That's an interesting aspect of science. But until you follow the scientific method, you're not actually doing, real science. You're participating in a bigger project. But what happens is political institutions, people like Fauci and places like the CDC and WHO, they cherry pick these studies that, again, conform to narratives that they want to tell, and that's what they call science. And if people aren't savvy to that, they're how are they going to know? Unless you can find the doctors that actually read these papers and think about them and ask questions, you'll never know. You'll never know.
You speak a little bit about historical fraud, but maybe now talk a little bit about the fraud that we've been seeing the last couple of years at the heart of the pandemic.
Well, so one of the most it just blew my mind when I finally understood it, which is that it's quite a conversation. Let me put it this way: I started off making a 2-hour documentary. That was my aim, and it turned into a 7.5-hour documentary series. And I had to leave a lot on the cutting room floor. There were scientists who were emailing me you left me out of the entire documentary series. I was like, man, I didn't have time to get you in there. It's just too much. But the really extraordinary thing that I focused on was a group of doctors and scientists who went back and they read the initial scientific papers out of Wuhan at the end of 2019, and then the follow-up papers after that. And what they found was that these papers never actually showed that there was a virus, and it's never been shown ever since. To some of these doctors and scientists, that was a real surprise, and they were really it really sort of led them on a long journey into medical history that they hadn't been on before. Some of them had already been on that journey, and they weren't surprised at all, because what they had discovered was that the entire idea, the entire modern conception of viruses, of these little entities that float through the air, leave cells, enter into another cell, inject their RNA into another cell, take over that cell, and then create more of themselves that way. That entire conception was built in the 1950s and was never proven. In fact, it's been disproven many times in many ways. And what we've seen since the seminal paper in 1954 that has been used to establish this entire way of thinking is that all of these procedures grew that would sort of suggest that maybe this story is true. But then the experiments that were done that showed that it's not true are pushed aside. And it goes back to this sort of boys with toys thing. So we saw the growth of these different kinds of experiments, these different kinds of things that you could do in a laboratory that would push this idea, and it's a very, very seductive idea. It's sort of the modern equivalent of demons, right? In the 14th century, we might have thought you got sick because a little demon, took over your body. And that would have been a very, uncontroversial idea at that point in time. Well, in the 20th century, our conception of these kinds of things, I think, had a more sort of techno-materialistic patina. And the idea of this little RNA invader grew in the 1950s, as I said, and to the point now where, like my son and I play Nintendo. Like I got him like a classic old, NES system, and we used to play Dr. Mario, right? Dr. Mario. There's these little, you got to throw the pills to kill the virus, right? So it's now this idea of a virus actually existing and actually making you sick. People are like, well, yeah, of course, of course that exists, right? But actually, if you look at the scientific literature, the science it's terrible. It's terrible science, and we've paid a huge price for it as a society. But I think now that we've had the whole world shut down for 2 years, there's so many more people that are interested in, obscure medical history because they want to know what the hell's going on. And so we've seen, a real awakening, and it's really exciting to see all these sort of doctors, scientists, journalists, activists, working together, doing research, pulling history, doing new interviews, looking at new angles. So I think there's this like huge reawakening of intellectual curiosity, and I think it's politically really important. And I think if you aren't aware of it, you should get on the, get on the train or make yourself aware of it, because it's vitally important to your health to understand these, to understand what's going on. And it's fascinating and it's politically interesting. So I'm running my mouth, but
it's all good insights, and kind of leads me into my next question. You have a society that maybe the percentage isn't the minority of society are free thinkers, independent researchers. They don't necessarily headline read. They dig more into the notion of what's going on behind the scenes. What do you see now in terms of the future of how we're systematically doing that? You said yourself that there's an awakening happening of people in the scientific field, but for like the common person that goes to work every day, maybe not necessarily in science, is told by either the media or the experts, quote unquote, what to believe, what not to believe. What would you employ them to do? Where would they start in terms of unraveling the complex nature of what is everything that's happening? Yeah.
I would start from a very basic perspective. And to try to cut to the bone of it, what makes you sick are the food you eat, the water you drink, the air you breathe, your mental, spiritual experience of the world. Okay? Those are your inputs, right? Are you eating nutritious food? Are you drinking healthy, clean water? Are you breathing healthy, clean air? Are you stressing your body so that your body's constantly having to create hormones or different chemicals in order to live the life that you're living for various reasons, right? So that's really the A to the Z of health. You can go all the way back to Aristotle, where he said, look, there's two kinds of medicine in the world. There's medicine for slaves and there's medicine for free people. The medicine for slaves is you see a symptom, you give them a drug so they can go back to work. The medicine for free people is you ask questions to understand why they're sick. Okay? Most people participate in the system of medicine for slaves. And hey, sometimes you got to do that. Life isn't that easy, right? Sometimes you got to take some thing that's going to help alleviate your symptoms for a little while because you got to go to work, or you got to, pick up your kid from school, or whatever it is, okay? But fundamentally, when you think about what is health, it's thinking about what Aristotle said in terms of medicine for free people. And that is, what are your surroundings? What's coming into your body? What are you creating in your own body? And that's everything else besides that is a distraction. If you start there and you turn off the TV, you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, so that wraps that piece up. Kind of going back into your docuseries and also the whole widespread mania of this actual fraud. Why do you think this story is being shuttered? Why do you think, is it greed? Is it propaganda, as we spoke about? Why is this story being, hid away from the masses?
I mean, I think it's all of these things. I think it's greed. I think it's propaganda. I think it's, there's a lot of naivete out there. I think there's a lot of ambition involved. God, I mean, it's just, you could throw pretty much everything into the pot because it's such a gigantic experience of what we're going on, what we're living through. I think most doctors are not aware of the critical history of medicine. Like, for example, like when my wife and I first started looking into vaccines, she went to go talk to her doctor and said, I'm thinking about whether or not we should vaccinate our child. And the doctor, she got real mad, and she said, well, yeah, of course you have to. And, my wife said, well, I just wanted to know, your thoughts on it. And she just yelled at my wife. She was just like, well, I do it, and that's all you need to know. Yeah. She's like, I'm very, she said something stupid, like, I'm very, like, I don't know, like, nature-y or some garbage like that, and I do it, and that's all you need to know, and it was like, boom, shut it down. And then we went to go talk to a doctor who was anti-vax, and the guy sat down with us for 3 hours and answered all our questions, and we had a real talk with the guy. And it's not like, I mean, he's busy. Like, the guy's booked for years. It took us months to get on his schedule. And he put the time aside, and he said, yeah, you guys have questions, let's just do it. Let's talk all about it. And that kind of those are the two worlds that I think you'll experience. But the sad truth is that most doctors are like the first doctor. They get very triggered. They see it as a challenge any challenge is a challenge to their authority. It's a challenge to their knowledge, which frankly it is. But they don't have ill will. They're not trying to hurt anyone. But I think they've been a huge piece in what's gone on. But then, the system is managed by, layers of bureaucracy like the AMA which, will kick out doctors who speak out differently, right? So it's very hard to practice medicine if you disagree with what the AMA calls the standard of care, right? If you, in fact, they can write you up for it. They could take your license away if you practice medicine in a way that is not built on giving people pharmaceuticals and vaccines. Those are the two pillars of the entire medical system, that and surgery, right? So there's very little room within the modern medical system to practice in a different way than what the medical bureaucracies want you to do. So like the doctor that healed my wife when she was 30, he was a pathologist at a major hospital in New York City, but he quit. He was so fed up with the standard of care that was being practiced at that hospital. He didn't want to just prescribe pharmaceuticals and call it a day, right? He wanted to understand why people were sick. So he left and he opened up his own practice, and he was able to diagnose my wife very quickly and easily, right? And in many ways saved her life. So you have this huge, layer of doctors that have played a gigantic role in this. And I mean, sadly, if you look back at, at Nazism, what was the profession that supported the Nazis more than any other profession? It was the doctors. And they then put pressure on the nurses. And who participated in genocide at a higher level than almost any other profession was the nurses, who were being pressured by the doctors. So this gets very real very fast. Mm-hmm. And, if I don't know if you've lost people to what's going on, but, my wife and I are trying to keep count. I think we've seen eight people, maybe more, in the last 3 months that have either died or gotten a serious cancer. It's glaringly obvious that it's the injections. I've never had 8 people in 3 months die or come down with a rare cancer. It's glaringly obvious, but people have a very hard time recognizing that, and so you have some degree of as Jung said, you don't always want to see your shadow side. That's not, you're focused, facing forward. You don't want to look behind you. You have a lot of greed at the top of these companies. I mean, companies like Moderna and Pfizer, these companies, Pfizer's been found of all sorts of criminal, conduct over the decades. And, Moderna didn't have a marketable medical product for decades, until the quote unquote pandemic came along and saved their butts, but also saved the hedge fund investors who had put, billions of dollars into this company and companies like it. So, there's greed involved. There's people who are trying to do the right thing, but don't realize it. That what they're doing is actually quite harmful. I think you got groups like the World Economic Forum that are, trying to reshape the entire fabric of our society, and have put people in government, all over the world. Whether it's Trudeau or whether it's the woman in New Zealand or whether it's, people in Europe or, so you have like so many layers of what's happening. And then you have like, your ordinary, people in your town or your city that, you see at, the coffee shop or you see at work and, they participate as well. And is it, I think most people are, wear masks because they think they're trying to help their grandma or they think they're trying to, save their uncle or, from getting sick or something like that. From my perspective, they're participating in medical marketing. That's just it's certainly not helping anyone, and I think it's absolutely spreading an enormous amount of fear. I think just yesterday the CNN medical advisor who had been saying, "Where you got to wear your mask, got to wear your mask. It's good." I think just yesterday she came out. She said, "Actually, I think it's seriously impaired my child." Because it actually hit home. Oh my God, yeah, you don't wear a mask every day.
Yeah.
Because would you put it on your dog? Would you put a mask on your dog? Obviously not.
It's a muzzle, basically, at that point.
Yeah. So, it's just obvious when you see a dog breathes so passionately at such a high rate, right? That it's palpably ridiculous to put it on your dog, right? Our breathing's a little slower. It's a little smoother. So it doesn't seem as ridiculous to stop your own breathing process as when you look at it. But yeah, it's absurd, because how do you stay healthy? Let's go back to the most basic things.
Air.
What food do you eat? Do you breathe clean air? If you can't breathe, you're really limiting your health, right? It's kind of so.
Yeah, especially people that already have, there's people obviously that have trouble breathing conversely than others. So you put that, then it just adds a variable to a much harder time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, I think people who, you could start at the bottom. You could say, people who are just believing in this stuff, who are scared, who are participating out of fear and concern. And then you can go all the way up through the doctors, through the politicians. Some of them are, most of them, I'm sure, just they believe, the soup is good and you better participate in it. And they believe that their people believe it and they better, play ball because that's the only way they're going to get reelected. And then I think there's tons of money behind it. I mean, if you look at the financial incentives that were put in place for doctors to diagnose people as COVID victims, for hospitals to diagnose people as COVID victims, for hospitals to put people on ventilators, for hospitals to declare that if you died, that you were it was a COVID death. We're talking about billions of dollars and paid out in incentives to hospital systems. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars handed out to countries to participate in this game. There's
it's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, I don't think I can get my head around it, to be honest. It's too massive.
It's a lot, and I kind of want to wrap it right there. We're running on time, which brings me to my thing. Yeah, I'm upgrading this Zoom thing because these conversations could go longer. It's quite funny on my end, but tell the people how to get to your docuseries, how to learn more about the situation and all of that.
Oh yeah, great. Just go to www.theviraldelusion.com. And you can watch the first 2.5 hours for free. And then if you're interested and you want to learn more, it's like $11.99 to watch the other 5 hours. I think that the doctors and the scientists that I was speaking with are just gems. I mean, I just think they're absolute gems, and you shouldn't miss them, what they have to say. Their perspective on health, on history. It's very hard to find, and it's life-changing once the coin drops. It's really great. So I recommend it.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys for listening to another episode of the WREAK Havoc podcast. I appreciate it, and bye-bye.